typically when I'm asked to draw something, whether it's an environment or an object or a character or something of that nature, I like to look at references. And right off the bat, I want to say that references are not cheating. If you trace the reference, that is cheating. But you can look at references to get inspiration. And more importantly, I want to maybe talk a little bit more about how I use references. So in this particular example, I'm considering this idea of drawing a dungeon environment. And I'm using a website called Pinterest.com, and Pinterest allows you to visually bookmark images. And so these are just a few references that I've saved. And generally speaking, I like to collect a lot of references just so that I can thumb through and get some inspiration, see what color schemes are used, what textures are there, what are some compositional elements that I like. These are all the things that I look for when I'm looking at reference. I mean, outside of the fact of like how to draw something, I look at lighting and I look at the way things are laid out just to give me a better handle on what I'm getting myself into. And it also serves as kind of like a way of kind of like, kicking in the creative juices. So, when I go to the drawing board, I have some starting point. So I'll be creating a dungeon, area here. And, a lot of the things that I think that are kind of interesting about some of these layouts is that they're not necessarily perfectly, symmetrical. The shapes in some cases are, but in a lot of other cases, the shapes are a little bit more unusual. And what I like is this kind of like tunnel effect where you're kind of walking through these various chambers. And I like some of the doors, they're kind of rounded off. There's a lot of stone, and the stone looks like it's kind of, piecemeal together. So when I look at these references, I'm just looking to get some inspiration, and I'm also looking at layout and so forth. So I'm going to put this on a separate display here and just, kind of ideate a little bit here. So I'm using my square brush, which I've made in a previous video. It's my perfect brush, or perfect for me, brush for sketching. And I'm just going to start out with just like making a grid. And I'm going to freehand this grid this time around as opposed to using the other tricks that I've talked about, just because I want to just organically create some ideas here before I settle in on something that's going to be finalized. So I'm going to start off with just a simple 1-point perspective grid. I don't have to, but this is just kind of like usually where I end up starting. And what I'll do is maybe just extend this grid out a little bit more to give it more of a hallway type of feel. And at this stage, I'm not looking for a finished product. I'm just getting ideas in place. Do I want to have it like a, straight on corridor? Maybe, I don't know. So let's just go ahead and see what that looks like. So maybe in this particular case, we have these kind of oblong, like the hallway kind of just moves off, and we see these repeated rectangular structures. It looks kind of interesting, right? And my grid would kind of follow in that direction. So that's one potential idea, and maybe I could have a doorway. So I'm just sketching and just kind of considering what I want to include in the sketch. Not really worried so much about details at this stage, but just roughly laying out what I have in mind. And then in terms of the prison doors, some of the doors are just, iron granite doors. For now, I think what I'll do is I'll just kind of indicate that. Put some lines here. And when I'm drawing these lines, I'm trying to match the perspective. I'm not super duper worried about details. All right, so I have that. That's one idea, right? Doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to go with it. So I'm going to challenge myself to come up with some other types of layouts. So another layout that I could have, I like this idea of, you know, a staircase leading down to kind of like a dungeon area. And I'm looking at one of my references where we have these steps that kind of descend down towards, you know, an area of interest. So this is all part of like the ideation, exploration phase. I'm not worried about being precious with it, just enough to where I have a general idea of what I'm trying to create. And then this staircase can maybe go down, maybe I'll just kind of extend it a little bit more. And we have a stone structure and maybe an arch. There might be some rocks and other stuff that's just kind of laying about. We might have some interesting stone. So this is me just kind of like feeling out my ideas. I haven't really locked into anything yet. I'm just looking at possibilities. Perhaps, you know, we have kind of like another corridor over here. Maybe another bigger corridor over here. Maybe there's like a little alcove, so there's like a little area where people can kind of disappear behind. I'm also thinking about scale too, so it's like if I'm looking at these steps, this door looks like it could be a little bit too small, so I'll just make the door a little bit longer. You got to think about scale, and this is like going to be a massive door. And then maybe there are going to be some jars or vessels, just something to add some visual interest. And we might have some torches that are used to kind of light the way. And that can be kind of atmospheric. Maybe there's another torch over here. Right? So that's possibility number 2. And I'm just shrinking those down here just because I'm exploring. This is part of the exploration process. And you can call it thumbnailing, you can call it, you know, whatever you wish. But the important thing is that you're just kind of not settling for the very first thing that you pop in your brain. So another idea, you know, again, looking at references that are on a different screen, is I like this idea of this really big dungeon door And there are some curved structures here that kind of look like eyes. And I'm just going to extend these down. And of course, it's going to have some thickness, and we're going to have some gates, and maybe this will actually have some of those sharp spikes. Kind of looks like a, a set of eyes and a mouth. And then of course this is going to like extend inward. And we have maybe a hallway. And I'm putting in some stone structures. Thinking about texture, thinking about placement. So like, okay, that's just one part of it. And then there's like another wall. And what if I actually had stairs that were descending down to this point? So that could be kind of interesting, where we're kind of coming from the standpoint of going down the stairs. Like we're on a higher plane coming down. And of course these are all going to be made out of stone too. And then over here, maybe there's a few dungeon doors. So as I am drawing, I'm kind of looking at my references to get an idea of composition, texture. And that's not saying that I'm going to go with what I've initially drawn here, but this is just me ideating. And there might be, a combination of these three that I utilize within the final drawing. I don't know yet. So those are my three contenders. I'll just shrink them all down. I'm looking at layout. Maybe I want a, let's do kind of a, almost like a bird's eye view. So we have these arches. Maybe the staircase comes out like this. You have to see how these structures are held up. I think the most interesting thing about, working from references are some of the things that just really are genuinely interesting and surprising that you may not already have in your mental model. Like these are, when you come across certain things in your references that are like, wow, I didn't even think about that. I had no idea that that existed or that was a thing. That's part of the excitement. That's where you can bring something new and fresh, and not just mimicking what you've seen in another show or another comic book. The idea of doing your own work and, trying not to fall into the stereotypical tropes, I think is really, really interesting. So we'll put the top of the stairs here. And we just move this off to the side, and maybe I'll extend this out like so. So we have a corridor here. maybe there's some lights that are kind of illuminating the way. And then we might have some doors. And this might be made out of wood or something really heavy. It might be reinforced. And we have the stone structures. So, you know, as I continue to explore, I'm getting more and more ideas. You know, the first one that I came up with was fairly generic. It's my first attempt at it, so it's not going to be that good. The second one, arguably, it's not so good either. But now I'm starting to get warmed up with this idea of, okay, I'm starting to get more, ideas that are kind of floating in. And I'll just do one more here. This time I'll go for, I guess, a more rounded type structure. Make these fairly thick. I'll kind of give them a little bit more of a pointedness. And it looks like I want to have a more curvature on the top. So I'll shrink this down. You know, a lot of folks, when they create thumbnails, they feel like they have to draw them really small. I think that if you're working digitally, you can draw them a little bit bigger than normal and then just shrink them down. So I've got these 3, or 4, 5 sketches or whatever, right? And there's some torches over here. And the other thing that I'm also thinking about too is, how do I establish some kind of interesting depth? So depth meaning that there's a foreground, midground, background. So that's why, when I'm thinking about these, like areas, I want to think about, like, how do I make something feel like I can walk through it? I don't want it to be flat. So maybe what are some other props that we can put? Well, maybe I know we've done the stair thing, a few times. But maybe we have like a wall of like skeletons of all the people that have already, there's just bones and other just, like a place where you just don't know where to store the stuff, and it just kind of just sits there. So that could be like the foreground element. That could almost set like a really, sense of foreboding about this area. And these would be all in the foreground, and I would just go ahead and shade them in so the viewer would see them and it would give you a very immediate feeling of like, you know, danger. And of course, I would have the cobblestones. So I'm looking at this and I'm like, okay, I've got several contenders here. As I continue to go through this, I'm getting, you know, a little bit more comfortable with this idea. And now I just want to see what I want to draw. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking out loud. It's like, what if I took, and I'll just number these. This is 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4, and this is 5. So, and I'll switch to a different color here. What if I took number 4 and, you know, added the skulls that I have in number 5 and just kind of move those in the foreground, kind of like creating a very creepy context. That's a possibility, right? And then I could also say, well, what if there's like a, you know, some kind of armor or some kind of, like this side over here looks fairly flat. It's almost like we're kind of like slicing that wall out. So what if I took number 4 and just kind of extended it out a little bit more, and then you have chests, you know. I didn't even think about the idea of like a treasure chest or anything, but just like you have some other objects that might be in this particular space littered with all the stuff. Maybe there's like, you know, old paintings or, you know, other junk, you know, that you would probably find in like some kind of a dungeon area. I'm gonna just go ahead and just maybe we're looking at this from kind of like a shelf. So there's like a top shelf that's sitting above this area, and this top shelf has skulls, maybe kept from the previous victims here. It's kind of like a grisly reminder. And then these skulls are in the immediate foreground, and we'll kind of maybe throw a little bit of cast shadows behind them just to kind of set them off a little bit. And so now I've got a scene that has some foreground, I've got a midground area, and then I've got like a background area. And this shelf kind of sits over here, and then we might be able to take some of the rocks and the other stuff that we had in this design over here. You know, a lot of these castles like were built, you know, in areas where, I mean, they had, this is a dungeon. It's not going to look, you know, pretty. There's just going to be a lot of, it's going to be dank. It's going to be wet. It's going to have dirt. So that's where I would end up starting from. So I guess my point with this video here is that, you know, look at references, and not only look at references in terms of how to draw something, but look at composition, look at texture, and then start mixing and matching. Start finding elements that, you know, you like and bring them in together. And that's going to happen when you do this like over the course of multiple drawings. If you just do this with 1 or 2 drawings, you're never really going to know. It's you know, it's a little bit presumptuous to say that the very first thing that you draw is going to be great. Could be, but usually in my experience, it's like it takes many more iterations. So I think I'm going to start with this this 4th one, but I'm going to go ahead and stop the video here. In the next video, I'll actually go through and I'll proceed to, you know, develop it out into a little bit more detail, and you know, pencil it, and then ink it up. All right, so thanks so much for watching this one. I'll see you in the next video.